I'm talking about addressing climate. All right. So as mentioned in the introduction, I run a venture firm where the purpose of the firm is to help humanity become a net positive to nature. So kind of all we do is work on environment and climate. And when I was first thinking about starting a firm, I was like, well, this is perfect, right? Like, because there are some things that we still need to invent. Look, there's a bunch of solutions that we already have to address climate, and we should get onto those that we already have for sure. But there's a lot that are in hard to decarbonize sectors, a lot of things around transportation as well, that we just don't have it totally cracked yet. So my initial thought is like venture, cross climate is going to be amazing. But as I've spent more time in this kind of world, then, because I was in venture a while ago and then got back into it to work on climate, and I didn't realize how, I don't know what's the right phrase, terrible venture had gotten. Because kind of this is what the venture world looks like right now. And if you go and look at the business models behind these, it's almost all this same thing, right? This enterprise SaaS business model, which to me is kind of like a virus that like got into people's brains and made them dumber, both at venture capital and at doing startups. Sorry if that's your business, but it's not the right type of business to address climate. And I say this because I've been around the folks trying to use these types of business models to address climate. And you have them in there like trying to pour stuff at the top of the funnel, just doing all the normal stuff, optimizing LTV, CAC, all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, how does that ever decarbonize a steel plant? You actually don't pour a bunch of stuff at the top of the funnel. There's a finite and small number of steel plants on the planet, right? You don't have millions that you can pour in there, just like you can pour millions of users hoping to capture some daily actives and monthly actives. No, it's finite and small. It's the number of coal-fired power plants, finite and small. The places where we make cement, finite and small. So this is just 1,000% the wrong business model, and we see a bunch of companies and entire firms that will only back business models like this to the detriment of actually trying to go work on climate directly. And I mention this because it wasn't always like this, right? If you go back to the very early days, then this is kind of a, of all the photographs that could be, seen as kind of kicking off Silicon Valley, this is as good as any. I guess the other one would be, Hewlett and Packard in their garage in the late 30s. But this is actually from Fairchild Semiconductor, and this is a picture of who came to become known as the Traitorous Eight. And over toward the right-hand side, you have Kleiner, of Kleiner Perkins fame, who kind of started one of the very first kind of modern venture capital firms and developed a lot of the documents and approaches that became venture capital. And notably, Kleiner was not, just a financier. He had a background in mechanical engineering, he had a background in manufacturing, and basically started investing in companies that helped to put the silicon in Silicon Valley. And in fact, all we did in a venture for the first 25 years was hardware, right? And that basically created, it's the reason why it's called Silicon Valley as opposed to Lines of Code Valley or Enterprise SaaS Valley. It's called Silicon Valley because those are the things that actually have made the biggest mark, right? If you want to think about how impactful, because every one of you guys have something in your pocket right now that only exists because of the work of this early Silicon Valley. But does anybody remember the biggest enterprise SaaS player that started exactly 10 years ago? Right, exactly. That's how impactful those companies are going to be. Like, it's already been 10 years, and you still don't remember them. It hasn't even been that long. But everything else, like, you actually have running in your pocket right now. And this is what it looks like to just go straight at the problem, right? There were some things that they were trying to solve about digital computing. Eventually, there was things that they solved around access to internet, and those were largely solved by doing hardware, and we changed what was physically possible in the world. Now, this is all zoomed in on venture, but I know a lot of you guys don't work in venture. So let's talk about the larger question of addressing climate. And the way that we have kind of cordoned off a lot of this larger question of addressing climate is basically the carbon markets and that kind of, and we're also looking at potentially having biodiversity credits and all these sorts of things. And all you got to know for this is that's the landscape. And it doesn't sound actually that much better than the landscape image that I showed you before. And this doesn't look that much better than the enterprise SaaS landscape, right? Like, this is us once again making stuff way too complicated. At the end of the day, you know, it's actually, I only got a couple minutes. I'm just going to jump right to it. Don't do any of this. This is dumb. And also, what? You know, like the CEO of Vera, the gold standard of this whole thing, resigned in the past year, right? Like, that's kind of, and that was like the most trusted body in the entire thing. Everybody else was less trustworthy. Think about that. The guy who was most trustworthy in the most trustworthy organization resigned because that organization wasn't trustworthy. Whoops. Okay, so we made it too complicated. What would be simpler? Well, we actually have solved this problem multiple times, and not just multiple times, but we've solved it recently. So for those that are old enough to remember this, 1987 was not that long ago, but the Montreal Protocol happened in 1987. And actually, I'll give you not just one, but I'll give you several, right? So Montreal Protocol had to do with recognizing that there was a big hole that was opening up in the ozone, and it was going to threaten basically all of life on Earth if we allowed that hole to keep growing. Sounds kind of familiar, huh? Not only did we succeed in getting rid of CFCs that were largely driving that, in the same time period, this is roughly the same time period that we were phasing out lead from gasoline. This was shortly after we had phased out DDT as a, as a kind of pest control approach, as like broad-scale pest control approach. And those are three substances which just don't exist as part of the industrial economy anymore. And we got all three of those done in less than 10 years. Now, Montreal Protocol, oh, and actually, the one thing to remember about how we got all this stuff done is they all worked on the same basic idea that polluter pays. There wasn't some credit system where if these people have done something virtuous and these people have done some bad thing, and then there's some third party that goes and validates that this is bad enough and this is good enough and this is tradable, and then there's a market exchange and this person wants to put it on blockchain, take 40% of it, right? So other people are laughing because that was your business model, sorry. But like, no, it was actually really straightforward, which is if you're still using this, here's how expensive it's going to be for you for every ton that you use, every kilogram that you use. And after a number of years, it'll be this expense, and after a number of years, it'll be that expense. And basically, they had targets for the relative usage of CFCs compared to 1987, and they actually allowed industry was already on a big up ramp. So they allowed industry to kind of finish their peak up at 150, and then they pushed hard, and within 10 years, we had actually wiped out that substance from industrial usage. Now, the uses, carbon pollution is not going to get wiped out in 10 years, but we could actually do a relatively similar approach and just make the timeline 30 years, right? Just give it a longer timeline, but be serious about the penalties. And if you do want to reward people that are restoring things, then you don't create a credit system, because the credit system creates lots of avenues to cheat, basically. You just have a simpler system where polluter pays and sequesterer gets paid. Right? And those are just separate. There's no trading that happens. There is no ability for you to, like, what are those Catholic things, like buying indulgences, right? There's no buying of indulgences, right? There's a whole fight about that church or something, I heard. Anyway, so what do we do in our firm? Well, we look at the landscape of emissions, and you actually see the way that we invest is in physical businesses that just directly go after that stuff. And this is how you might look at it if you're in venture. And we basically have we have one software company out of 36. So it gives you a sense of what I think is about the right ratio if you're trying to solve these problems for real. If you are not in venture and you are a big corporation that cares about these same things, don't get mucked up in the credit market. Just focus on insetting. Get really systematic on exactly where the damage, where the emissions are coming from. This is a little bit of a zoom in on IKEA, who's already worked on this quite a bit, and you can see most of their bars are actually quite low. The only one that's still left that is driving the big footprint is materials, and you see, they are continuing to explore how to make the most out of the least amount of materials as you see that progression from the left to the right. And I'll leave you with one last hopeful thing because I am out of time. But what does it look like to go directly after the fact that we already have too many emissions in the air? And most of you guys are already familiar. We have over 1 trillion ton excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and about 600 billion tons that have been dissolved in the ocean, driving acidity. And these are the places that can store a lot of carbon in a relatively small amount of time. Those are trees, histosols, and soils, basically. And something that is happening in the world right now is a company that we backed some years ago is actually out in Abu Dhabi, and every single day, including today, it says 8 people, but it's really just 4 people because we're training 4 people. But there's basically 4 people that are restoring 83 hectares of mangrove per day and establishing 100,000 mangroves per day. They plant about 120,000 post-germination survival and survival through adulthood. It comes out to about 100,000 mangrove trees that are being established per day. And think about how direct that is, right? Like, you want something to happen in the world, and you just go straight after it, and then you make it way cheaper, way more effective, way more efficient to just achieve the main thing, as opposed to kind of circulating around, how am I going to crack the code on credits, or how am I going to crack the code on this enterprise SaaS loop? And with that, that's the last point. Thank you so much.